The distant crack of a gunshot echoed through the valley as Abigail Harrison ducked behind the weathered barrel outside the general store in Madisonville, Texas. Her heart raced against her ribs, the midday sun of 1874 bearing down mercilessly on her already warm face. She hadn't expected violence on her first day back in her hometown after 5 years away, but then again, nothing in Madisonville ever stayed peaceful for long. "Get back inside, miss," a deep voice called out, just as another shot rang through the air. Abigail glanced toward the voice, seeing a tall man with a weathered Stetson crouched behind a water trough across the dusty street. Blood was spreading across his left shoulder, staining his blue shirt a disturbing crimson. Despite his injury, he was focused on the saloon doorway, revolver steady in his right hand. "You're hurt," she called back, gathering her skirts and preparing to run to him. "Stay put," he ordered, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "Man up there's got a Winchester." As if to confirm his warning, a bullet splintered the wood of the barrel inches from Abigail's face. She flinched, but remained resolute. 5 years studying medicine in Boston had taught her to keep calm in emergencies. That man needed help, and she wasn't about to let him bleed out in the street. The town's sheriff emerged from his office, firing 2 quick shots toward the saloon's second-floor window. "Lucas, get to cover, son." The wounded man, Lucas, apparently seized the opportunity to dash across the street toward Abigail. He slid into the space beside her, his breathing labored, face tight with pain. "You picked a fine day to visit Madisonville," he muttered, reloading his Colt with practiced efficiency despite his injury. "I live here," Abigail replied, already examining his shoulder with a professional gaze. "Or I used to, just got back from medical school in Boston." His blue eyes widened slightly. "A lady doctor, not officially, not yet." She ripped a strip of fabric from her petticoat without hesitation, "but I know enough to see that bullet needs to come out." More gunshots rang out, followed by shouting. Sheriff Morgan had apparently called for reinforcements, and the shooter's attention was diverted. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Abigail insisted, applying pressure to the wound. "My father's clinic is just down the street." Lucas Dawson, for that was his full name, though Abigail wouldn't learn it until later, nodded grimly. "Lead the way, miss." "Harrison, Abigail Harrison," recognition flashed in his eyes. Doc Harrison's daughter, the very same. Together, they made their way down the boardwalk, ducking into the small whitewashed building that served as Madisonville's only medical clinic. The familiar smell of carbolic acid and herbs greeted Abigail, a strange comfort amid the chaos. "Father," she called out, but the clinic was empty. "Probably out at the Miller place," Lucas said through gritted teeth. "Heard their boy took sick yesterday." Abigail guided him to the examination table. "Sit here, I need to look at that wound properly." Lucas complied, though his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings, alert even through his pain. "You sure you know what you're doing, Miss Harrison?" "I've assisted with bullet removals before," she replied, gathering supplies from her father's cabinets. "And please call me Abigail." She approached him with a basin of water and clean cloths. "I'll need to remove your shirt." Lucas hesitated, then nodded. Abigail stepped closer, carefully helping him out of his bloodied shirt. His muscles tensed beneath her fingers as she eased the fabric away from the wound. "You'll get blood on you," he warned softly as crimson droplets fell onto her sleeve. Abigail met his gaze steadily. "I don't mind." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection, an understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Abigail broke the spell first, returning her attention to his injury. "The bullet's still in there," she said after careful examination. "I'll need to remove it." Lucas nodded, his jaw tight. "Do what you need to do." Abigail prepared the instruments, sterilizing them in alcohol as she'd been taught. "This will hurt," she warned, offering him a strip of leather to bite down on. He declined with a shake of his head. "Not my first bullet, Miss Abigail." She worked methodically, her hands steady despite the gravity of the situation. Lucas remained silent throughout the procedure, His only reactions the occasional sharp intake of breath and the beads of sweat forming on his brow. "You're doing well," she murmured encouragingly as she located the bullet and carefully extracted it. It made a dull clink as she dropped it into a metal pan. "There," she said, beginning to clean and dress the wound. "You're lucky it missed anything vital." "Wouldn't call getting shot lucky," Lucas replied, a ghost of a smile crossing his face despite the pain. "Luckier than the alternative," Abigail countered, finishing the bandage. "Who was shooting at you anyway?" Lucas's expression darkened. "Man named Fletcher. Has a grudge against me for bringing in his brother last month. I'm a bounty hunter," Abigail finished for him, the pieces falling into place. The weathered look, the practiced way he handled his gun, the wariness in his eyes. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, actually," he corrected. "Though I do my fair share of tracking." Abigail's eyebrows rose. "A marshal? In Madisonville?" "Just passing through," Lucas said, carefully testing his shoulder's mobility. "Tracking a gang that's been hitting banks across the territory. Word is they might be heading this way." Outside, the commotion had died down. The sheriff's voice could be heard giving orders, suggesting the immediate danger had passed. "You should rest," Abigail advised, cleaning her hands in the basin. "That wound needs time to heal." Lucas stood, swaying slightly before regaining his balance. "No time for that. Need to report to Sheriff Morgan." "At least let me give you a clean shirt first," Abigail insisted, retrieving one from a cabinet where her father kept spare clothing for patients. "Father won't mind." Lucas accepted the shirt with a nod of thanks. As Abigail helped him into it, mindful of his injured shoulder, their eyes met again. This time his gaze lingered, taking in her features with quiet appreciation. "Thank you, Abigail Harrison," he said softly. "I'm in your debt." "Just doing what anyone would do," she replied, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Not anyone," Lucas countered. "Not everyone would risk their safety for a stranger." Before she could respond, the clinic door opened and Sheriff Morgan entered, his weathered face creased with concern. "Dawson, you all right? Fletcher's been apprehended." "I'm fine, thanks to Miss Harrison here," Lucas replied, stepping back from Abigail with reluctance. "Abby." The sheriff's expression brightened. "Well, didn't know you were back in town. Your father said you weren't due until next week." "I finished my exams early," Abigail explained, suddenly conscious of her blood-stained dress and disheveled appearance. "Thought I'd surprise him." "Well, you certainly surprised us all," the sheriff chuckled before turning serious again. "Dawson, we need to talk about what happened, and about those Harmon boys you've been tracking." Lucas nodded, but his eyes returned to Abigail. "I'll come by later if that's all right, to check on the wound." Abigail felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. "Of course, Father and I will be here." As the men left, Abigail found herself standing alone in the clinic, the events of the past hour washing over her. She'd been back in Madisonville for less than a day, and already her life had taken an unexpected turn. Little did she know, it was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a whirlwind for Abigail. Her father, Dr. James Harrison, had been overjoyed at her early return, proudly introducing her to patients as "my daughter, the future doctor." The townsfolk's reactions ranged from polite skepticism to outright disapproval. A woman doctor was still a novel concept, especially in a traditional town like Madisonville. Lucas Dawson had indeed returned to the clinic that evening, his manner more formal in Dr. Harrison's presence. The older doctor had examined Lucas's wound, nodding approvingly at Abigail's handiwork before redressing it. "You've learned well," her father had said proudly, while Lucas watched her with those intense blue eyes. Now, 3 days later, Abigail was organizing supplies in the clinic when the door opened, bringing with it a gust of hot June air and the now familiar figure of Marshal Dawson. "Miss Harrison," he greeted, removing his hat. He looked better, color had returned to his face, and he moved with more ease despite the sling supporting his left arm. "Marshal Dawson," she returned with a smile. "How's the shoulder?" Healing well, thanks to your care. He stepped further into the clinic, glancing around. Your father around? He's at the Wilsons' place. Their daughter's time has come. Lucas nodded, seemingly relieved to find her alone. I came to say goodbye. Got word the Harmon gang was spotted near Austin. I'm heading out tomorrow morning. Abigail felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. So soon. Your wound will heal on the trail, he finished for her. Duty calls. She nodded, understanding but not liking it. In just a few days, Marshal Lucas Dawson had become a fixture in her thoughts. His daily visits to the clinic, initially for medical reasons, had evolved into something more: conversations about her studies, his travels, books they'd both read. He was unlike any man she'd known, educated despite his frontier upbringing, thoughtful beneath his rugged exterior. I brought you something, Lucas said, interrupting her thoughts. He reached into his pocket with his good hand and produced a small book. Saw it at the general store and thought of you. Abigail accepted the gift, her fingers brushing against his. It was a copy of Gray's Anatomy, the newest edition she'd been wanting but couldn't yet afford. Lucas, this is. Words failed her. The book was expensive, not something one purchased on a lawman's salary without sacrifice. Consider it payment for saving my life, he said simply. Thank you, she managed, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. An awkward silence fell between them, laden with unspoken words. I was wondering, Lucas finally said, his usual confidence wavering, if you might allow me to write to you while I'm away. Abigail's heart quickened. I'd like that very much. Relief washed over his features. Good, that's good. Another silence, but comfortable this time. Would you care to join me for dinner? Abigail asked suddenly, surprising even herself with the boldness of the invitation. Father won't be back until late, and I was just about to close the clinic. Lucas's smile warmed his entire face. I'd be honored, Miss Harrison. They dined at Abigail's home, a modest but comfortable house adjacent to the clinic. She prepared a simple meal, nothing fancy, but Lucas appreciated it as if it were a feast at a fine hotel. Been a while since I had a home-cooked meal, he admitted as they sat at the small dining table. Trail rations get tiresome. I can imagine, Abigail replied, watching him with curiosity. How did you become a marshal, Lucas? He set down his fork, considering the question. My father was a lawman in Missouri, taught me to shoot, to track. After he was killed by outlaws, I drifted west, did some ranch work. Eventually signed on as a deputy in Fort Worth. Marshal service recruited me 3 years ago. Do you enjoy it? The constant travel, the danger, Lucas's expression grew thoughtful. Enjoy isn't the right word, it's purposeful. I'm good at finding people who don't want to be found. And every criminal I bring in means one less threat to decent folks trying to build something out here. He paused. But I won't lie, it gets lonely. Abigail understood loneliness. Despite being surrounded by people in Boston, she'd often felt isolated, a woman in a man's profession, forever having to prove herself worthy. What about you? Lucas asked, steering the conversation away from himself. Why medicine? My mother died of fever when I was 12, Abigail replied. The old pain softened but never entirely gone. Father did everything he could, but we didn't know then what we know now about infection. I decided that day I wanted to help people, to learn everything I could about healing. She smiled wryly. Father was supportive, but many weren't. Women aren't supposed to have such ambitions. Those people are fools, Lucas said with unexpected vehemence. The West needs good doctors, man or woman shouldn't matter. His support warmed her, especially knowing his traditional background. That's not a common view. Never much cared for common views, he replied with a half smile. They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily between them. Lucas told stories of his travels across the territories, of the beauty and harshness of the frontier. Abigail shared tales of Boston, of medical breakthroughs and the changing world back east. As the clock struck 10, Lucas reluctantly rose to leave. I should go. Early start tomorrow. Abigail walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. How long will you be gone? Hard to say. Couple of weeks, maybe longer if the trail goes cold. He hesitated at the threshold. I'll write when I can. I'll look forward to it, she replied softly. Lucas studied her face in the lamplight, as if committing it to memory. Then, with gentle deliberation, he reached for her hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply affecting. Goodbye, Abigail Harrison, he murmured against her fingers. Until we meet again, Lucas Dawson, she responded, her voice barely above a whisper, after he left. Abigail remained at the door for a long moment, the ghost of his touch lingering on her hand. It was foolish, she knew, to feel such attachment to a man she'd known less than a week, a man whose life was spent chasing danger across the frontier. Yet as she finally turned away, she couldn't deny the truth. Marshal Lucas Dawson had claimed a piece of her heart, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted it back. The weeks that followed Lucas's departure were filled with work for Abigail. She assisted her father in the clinic, visited patients in their homes, and began establishing herself as a medical professional in her own right. Some in town remained skeptical of a female doctor, but many, particularly the women, welcomed having someone they felt more comfortable confiding in. True to his word, Lucas wrote. His first letter arrived 2 weeks after he left, delivered by a passing stagecoach. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a man who spent most of his time in the saddle, the words thoughtfully chosen. He wrote of his pursuit of the Harmon gang, of the landscapes he traversed, of small towns and the characters he encountered. Between the lines, Abigail sensed his loneliness, his weariness with the constant pursuit. He asked about her days, about the town, about her father's health. Abigail replied immediately, her letter filled with news of Madisonville, amusing stories about patients and descriptions of the summer wildflowers blooming across the Texas hills. She found herself opening up about her hopes and doubts, writing things she'd never said aloud to anyone. A pattern established itself. Letters exchanged every 2 weeks or so, each one longer and more personal than the last. By the end of July, Abigail found herself counting days between communications, rushing to the post office whenever the stagecoach arrived. Got yourself a beau back east. Martha Johnson, the postmaster's wife, asked knowingly one day as she handed Abigail a thick envelope bearing Lucas's now familiar script. Just a friend, Abigail replied, unable to prevent the blush that rose to her cheeks. If you say so, dear, Martha responded with a wink. August brought sweltering heat and an outbreak of summer fever to Madisonville. Abigail and her father worked tirelessly, moving from house to house, treating the sick, offering comfort where medicine failed. The epidemic took 6 lives, mostly the elderly and very young, before running its course. Through it all, Lucas's letters were Abigail's solace. He had tracked the Harmon gang to New Mexico territory, nearly capturing them twice. His shoulder had healed well, he assured her, though it still ached when rain was coming. Then, in early September, the letters stopped. 2 weeks passed with no word, then 3. Abigail tried to quell her growing concern. Mail was unreliable on the frontier, letters were lost, delayed, misdelivered. Lucas might be in a remote area with no access to post, or he might be injured, or worse. The thought haunted her nights, creeping into her dreams and turning them to nightmares, where she searched endless desert landscapes for a man who was never there. It was during this period of anxious waiting that trouble came to Madisonville in the form of 3 dust-covered riders who arrived one Friday afternoon. Abigail was attending Mrs. Peterson's broken wrist when she heard commotion from the direction of the bank. Gunshots followed, then screaming. "Stay inside," she instructed Mrs. Peterson firmly, moving to the window in time to see 3 men emerging from the bank, bandanas covering their faces, guns drawn. They fired warning shots into the air as they mounted their horses. With sickening clarity, Abigail realized what was happening. A bank robbery in broad daylight. Sheriff Morgan and his deputy appeared from the jailhouse, but they were too late. The robbers were already galloping out of town, heading south. That evening, the town buzzed with the news. The robbers had made off with over $2,000, the payroll for the new railroad spur being built north of town. Sheriff Morgan had organized a posse to pursue them, but had returned empty-handed after losing their trail at the river. "Professionals," Abigail overheard the sheriff telling her father as she prepared evening coffee. "Knew exactly when the money would be there, got in and out clean, has all the hallmarks of the Harmon gang." Abigail nearly dropped the coffee pot. "The Harmon gang, here." Both men turned to her in surprise. "You know of them?" Sheriff Morgan asked. "Marshal Dawson mentioned them," she replied carefully. "He was tracking them before he left." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Been hitting banks all across Texas and the territories. 3 men led by Jeremiah Harmon. Killed 2 lawmen in Arkansas last year." He sighed heavily. "I sent a telegram to the Marshal's office in Austin. With luck, they'll dispatch someone to help us track these vermin." Abigail couldn't shake the connection. If the Harmons were here and Lucas had been pursuing them, where was he? The question tormented her as she lay awake that night. Staring at the ceiling while rain pattered against the roof, her answer came 3 days later, just before sunset. Abigail was closing the clinic, her father having already gone home for supper, when the door burst open. A man stumbled in, supporting another whose face was hidden by a rain-drenched hat. Both were soaked to the skin, mud-splattered and exhausted. "Need help," the first man gasped. "My friend's been shot." Abigail immediately directed them to the examination table. "Let me see him." As the wounded man was lowered onto the table, his hat fell away, revealing a face she knew as well as her own despite having seen it for only a few days. "Lucas," she breathed, shock and relief warring within her, his eyes, glazed with pain, focused on her face. Recognition sparked through the haze. Abigail, his companion, a grizzled man in his 50s with a deputy marshal's badge, looked between them in surprise. "You two know each other?" "Yes," Abigail replied, already examining Lucas's wound, a bullet hole in his right thigh that had been hastily bandaged. "What happened?" "Ambush," the older marshal explained as Abigail cut away Lucas's blood-soaked pant leg. "We've been tracking the Harmon gang for weeks. Finally caught up to them yesterday near the border. There was a shootout. Dawson here took a bullet but managed to wing Jeremiah Harmon before they escaped. We followed their trail," Lucas added weakly. "Led straight to Madisonville." "They robbed our bank 3 days ago," Abigail confirmed, cleaning the wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but infection was setting in. "Lucas, this needs proper treatment. You're running a fever." "No time," he insisted, trying to sit up despite his weakness. "They're planning something bigger. You need to lie still," Abigail interrupted firmly, pushing him back down. "You've lost blood and this wound is infected. You won't be any use to anyone if you're dead." The older marshal, who introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Frank Cooper, nodded in agreement. "She's right, Dawson. You need tending. I'll go speak with the sheriff, see what we can piece together." After Cooper left, Abigail worked quickly to clean and treat Lucas's wound, applying a poultice to draw out the infection before rebandaging it properly. Throughout the procedure, Lucas watched her, his eyes clearing somewhat as she worked. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Abigail glanced up from her work. "For what?" "For showing up like this, for not writing. We were deep in Apache territory, no posts for weeks." "I was worried," she admitted softly, "when I heard about the bank robbery and realized it might be the Harmon gang." "I wanted to warn you," Lucas said, reaching for her hand. His palm was hot with fever. "We figured out they were heading this way, but we were too late." Abigail squeezed his hand. "You're here now, that's what matters." She helped him drink a bitter herbal tea, her father's remedy for infection and fever, then prepared a cot in the back room of the clinic. "You need rest. The infection isn't severe yet, but it could worsen quickly." Lucas didn't argue, a testament to how poorly he felt. As Abigail helped him to the cot, he leaned heavily on her, his usual strength sapped by injury and illness. "You'll get blood on you," he murmured as fresh blood seeped through the bandage, staining her dress where he leaned against her. Just as she had on their first meeting, Abigail met his gaze steadily. "I don't mind." A ghost of a smile crossed his fever-flushed face. "Thought about you every day," he admitted, the fever perhaps loosening his usual reserve. "Wrote letters in my head when I couldn't send real ones." Abigail's heart swelled at the confession. "I thought about you too," she replied softly, helping him lie down. "Now rest, we'll talk more when you're feeling better." She stayed with him through the night, bathing his brow with cool cloths as the fever peaked, replacing the poultice when needed, monitoring his breathing. Her father arrived, alerted by Deputy Marshal Cooper, and together they tended to Lucas through the worst of it. By dawn, the fever had broken. Lucas slept peacefully, his breathing regular, his skin cooler to the touch. Abigail, exhausted but relieved, finally allowed herself to doze in the chair beside his cot. She awoke to the sensation of fingers gently brushing hair from her face. Opening her eyes, she found Lucas watching her, his gaze clear and warm. "You stayed," he observed quietly. "Of course," she replied, straightening in her chair. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a buffalo," he admitted with a weak smile, "but better." Before they could say more, the clinic door opened, admitting Sheriff Morgan and Deputy Marshal Cooper. Their expressions were grave. "We've got trouble," the sheriff announced without preamble. "Got word from a ranch hand who rode in this morning. The Harmon gangs hold up at the old Peterson mine about 5 miles south, and they've got hostages." "Hostages?" Abigail echoed, alarmed. "2 railroad surveyors they grabbed yesterday," Cooper explained. "Demanding safe passage and the return of the bank money, or they start shooting hostages at noon today." Lucas struggled to sit up. "What time is it now?" "Just past 8, the sheriff replied. "We're gathering men, but we're outgunned." "The Harmons have at least 5 men with them now, must have met up with the rest of their gang." "I'm coming with you," Lucas declared, attempting to stand. "Like hell you are," Abigail protested, pushing him back down. "You can barely walk." "She's right, Dawson," Cooper said firmly. "You'd be a liability in your condition. Besides, we need someone here in case they try to hit the town while we're occupied at the mine." Reluctantly, Lucas conceded the point. "At least take my Winchester and watch the South Ridge. Jeremiah likes high ground." After the men left, Abigail helped Lucas to a proper chair in the clinic's front room where he could keep watch through the window. Despite her protests, he insisted on having his revolver within reach. "You should be resting," she scolded, bringing him a plate of food and fresh coffee. "Can't rest knowing what's happening," he replied, his expression troubled. "I've been tracking these men for months, Abigail. They're dangerous, desperate." "And our men are prepared," she countered, though worry gnawed at her as well. Sheriff Morgan was competent, but the Harmon gang's reputation was fearsome. The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Abigail attended to the few patients who came to the clinic, but most townsfolk were either preparing for potential trouble or gathered near the jailhouse, awaiting news from the mine. Just before noon, the distant sound of gunfire echoed from the south. Abigail's heart jumped to her throat. Lucas tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. "It started," he said grimly. The sporadic gunfire continued for nearly an hour, then fell silent. The town held its collective breath, waiting. It was mid-afternoon when riders appeared on the road from the South. Sheriff Morgan and his posse, with Deputy Marshal Cooper among them. From their demeanor, Abigail could tell they'd been successful. There was no urgency in their approach, no sign of pursuit. "It's over," she said with relief, turning to Lucas, but his expression remained tense, his eyes scanning the returning group. "Something's wrong, there should be prisoners." As the riders drew closer, Abigail realized he was right. There were no bound men among them, no sign of captured outlaws. Sheriff Morgan came directly to the clinic, his face grim beneath a layer of dust and gunpowder residue. "We got the hostages out safely," he reported, "but the Harmons escaped." Again, Lucas cursed under his breath. "How?" "Had a hidden tunnel in the mine," Cooper explained, following the sheriff in. Old escape shaft that wasn't on any maps. By the time we secured the hostages and found it, they were long gone. Which direction? Lucas demanded. The sheriff and Cooper exchanged glances. That's the other problem, Morgan said. They split up. Jeremiah and one man headed west toward the territories. The other three rode east. They're drawing us off, Lucas concluded, his frustration evident. Classic Harmon tactic. The real target is elsewhere. But what target? Abigail wondered aloud. They've already hit the bank. A terrible possibility dawned on Lucas's face. The railroad paymaster, he said urgently. When does he arrive? Sheriff Morgan's eyes widened. Tomorrow morning, stagecoach from Austin carrying the replacement payroll after the robbery. That's their play, Lucas said with certainty. They knew we'd follow the larger group east. Meanwhile, Jeremiah circles back to hit the stage. It'll be carrying what, $5,000? At least, the sheriff confirmed grimly. And the stage route passes right through Comanche Gorge, perfect spot for an ambush. We need to warn them, reroute the stage, Cooper declared, already turning to leave. Too late for that, Morgan replied. Stage left Austin yesterday. No telegraph stations between here and Comanche Gorge. Then we intercept it, Lucas insisted, again attempting to stand. This time his leg buckled immediately, and only Abigail's quick action prevented him from falling. You're not intercepting anything, she said firmly. That wound could reopen at the slightest exertion. Cooper nodded in agreement. I'll go, take a fresh horse, ride through the night. I can reach Baker's Crossing by dawn, wait for the stage there. The men quickly formulated their plan. Cooper would attempt to intercept the stage before it reached the gorge, while Sheriff Morgan would gather fresh men to pursue the eastern group, hoping to capture at least some of the gang. As they prepared to leave, Lucas pulled Cooper aside. Frank, be careful. Jeremiah Harmon is smarter than he looks, and he won't hesitate to kill. I know, the older Marshal replied solemnly. Been chasing outlaws since before you were born, son. He glanced toward Abigail, who was gathering supplies across the room. You got something good waiting for you here. Don't throw it away being stubborn about that leg. Lucas followed his gaze, his expression softening as it rested on Abigail. I won't. After the lawman departed, an uneasy quiet settled over the clinic. Abigail insisted Lucas return to the cot for proper rest, and he complied with minimal argument, a testament to his exhaustion. You should go home, he told her as she checked his bandages. Get some real rest yourself. I'm staying, she replied simply, adjusting his pillow. Father's handling any emergency calls tonight. Lucas caught her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. Why? Abigail met his gaze, deciding honesty was the only appropriate response. Because I spent weeks wondering if you were dead. Now that I know you're alive, I'm not letting you out of my sight. A slow smile spread across his face. That's fair. She settled in the chair beside his cot, a medical journal in hand. Lucas watched her for a long moment before speaking again. When this is over, when the Harmons are caught, I've been thinking about requesting a transfer. Abigail looked up in surprise. A transfer? Where to? Somewhere with less riding, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Maybe a marshal's office in a growing town. Somewhere a man might put down roots. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Any particular town in mind? Abigail asked softly. Depends, Lucas answered, on whether there might be a reason to stay in one place. Abigail's heart quickened. There might be, she ventured. In the right place. The smile that illuminated Lucas's face then was worth all the weeks of worry, all the uncertainty. He reached for her hand again, and this time she met him halfway. Get some rest, she murmured, squeezing his fingers gently. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. What tomorrow brought was news both good and bad. Deputy Marshal Cooper had successfully intercepted the stagecoach before it reached Comanche Gorge, averting the planned robbery. But Jeremiah Harmon had escaped once again, vanishing into the vast expanse of the Western Territories. The Eastern Group hadn't fared much better. Sheriff Morgan's posse had captured one man, a young outlaw named Tate, who'd only recently joined the Harmons, but the other two had eluded them. "It's not over," Lucas said grimly when he heard the news. "Jeremiah won't give up that easily." A week passed with no sign of the remaining outlaws. Lucas's wound healed steadily under Abigail's care, and soon he was able to walk short distances with the aid of a cane. Deputy Marshal Cooper departed for Austin, taking the captured Tate with him to stand trial. Lucas, despite receiving orders to return to Austin once he was fit to travel, showed no inclination to leave Madisonville. Instead, he assisted Sheriff Morgan, reviewing what they knew of the Harmon gang's patterns, telegraphing other lawmen across the territory for information. "You think they'll return?" Abigail observed one evening as they sat on the porch of her father's house, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Jeremiah's proud," Lucas replied, absently rubbing his healing thigh, "and he holds grudges. I've wounded him twice now, captured one of his men. He won't let that stand." Abigail shivered despite the warmth of the evening. "That's not exactly comforting." Lucas's hand found hers on the porch railing. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised, his voice low and fierce. "Or this town." She turned to face him, studying his profile in the fading light. "And after, when the Harmons are dealt with, will you stay?" Lucas met her gaze, his blue eyes serious. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," Abigail answered without hesitation. "I do." The distance between them disappeared as Lucas leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek. When his lips met hers, Abigail felt as if every moment of her life had been leading to this one, this man, this place, this perfect connection of hearts. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with shared longing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you pulled that bullet out of my shoulder," he confessed. Abigail smiled. "What took you so long, Marshal?" Before he could answer, a shout from the street interrupted them. Sheriff Morgan was hurrying toward the house, his expression urgent. "Dawson, stage just arrived from Austin. Driver had this for you." He handed Lucas a telegram. As he read it, his expression darkened. "What is it?" Abigail asked, concern replacing the warmth of moments before. "Jeremiah Harmon broke his brother out of jail in El Paso 3 days ago," Lucas reported grimly. "2 guards killed. Lord have mercy," the sheriff muttered. "Where are they headed?" Lucas's gaze met Abigail's, his eyes filled with determination and regret. "The message says they were last seen riding east, toward Madisonville." The following days were tense with preparation. Sheriff Morgan organized the townsmen into patrol groups. Lucas, though still favoring his injured leg, refused to remain idle, helping train volunteers in basic defense tactics. Abigail divided her time between the clinic and assisting the town's women in preparing for potential trouble. Extra food was cooked, medical supplies gathered, safe locations established where children and the elderly could shelter if violence erupted. Through it all, Lucas and Abigail found moments together, brief interludes of connection amid the growing tension. A shared meal. A quiet conversation on the clinic porch. Hands finding each other beneath the dinner table at her father's house. Neither spoke of love, yet it grew between them nonetheless, nurtured by shared purpose and mutual respect. Dr. Harrison observed their deepening bond with quiet approval, confiding to Abigail one night that Lucas reminded him of himself as a young man, determined, honorable, and smart enough to recognize a remarkable woman when he meets one. 10 days after receiving the telegram, Lucas was strong enough to ride short distances. He and Sheriff Morgan began scouting the approaches to town, establishing lookout points, planning defenses. It was during one such patrol, as they rode the eastern trail about 3 miles from town, that they discovered fresh tracks, 5 horses, moving fast but cautiously, diverging from the main road toward a seldom-used hunting path. "It's them," Lucas confirmed, studying the tracks. "Trying to approach town undetected," Sheriff Morgan nodded grimly. How long ago? Few hours at most. They'll wait for darkness before making their move. They rode back to Madisonville at a gallop, raising the alarm. By sundown, the town was prepared. Men positioned at strategic points, women and children gathered in the stone church, the streets eerily empty. Lucas insisted Abigail remain at the clinic, knowing wounded would need care before the night was through. Her father joined her, organizing their supplies with grim efficiency. "Be careful," Abigail told Lucas as he prepared to leave, checking his revolver and the Winchester rifle he'd recovered from the sheriff's office. "That leg still isn't fully healed." "I will," he promised, drawing her into a brief, fierce embrace. "Stay inside no matter what you hear." Darkness fell, bringing with it an oppressive silence. Abigail and her father waited in the dimly lit clinic, listening for the conflict they knew was coming. An hour passed, then another. Just after midnight, the stillness shattered with the crack of gunfire from the south end of town. More shots followed, then shouting. "It's begun," Dr. Harrison said quietly, moving to ensure the lamps were dimmed to make the clinic less of a target. The gunfight seemed to move through town, shots echoing between buildings as the outlaws and townsmen exchanged fire. Abigail tried to track the sounds, her heart racing whenever shots came from near the sheriff's office where she knew Lucas was positioned. A sudden commotion at the clinic door startled them both. Two townsmen burst in, supporting a third whose shoulder was bleeding profusely. "Pete Sullivan," one gasped, "took a bullet watching the livery." Abigail and her father immediately went to work, examining the wound, extracting the bullet, bandaging. As they finished, more wounded arrived, thankfully with minor injuries. The gunfire outside had diminished to occasional shots, the shouting more distant. Abigail was washing blood from her hands when the clinic door crashed open. She turned, expecting more wounded, only to freeze at the sight of a tall man with a ragged beard and wild eyes, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. In his hand was a revolver pointed directly at her. "You the doctor?" he demanded. "I am," Dr. Harrison replied, stepping forward protectively. "What do you need? My brother's shot," the man snarled. "You're coming with me, now." With terrible certainty, Abigail realized she was looking at Jeremiah Harmon himself. The resemblance to the younger Harmon she'd glimpsed being taken to the jailhouse was unmistakable. "I'll come," her father said calmly, reaching for his medical bag. "Where is he? Both of you," Harmon insisted, gesturing with his gun. "No tricks." Abigail met her father's eyes, seeing his fear for her and his resolve. They had no choice. Refusing would only get them killed. "We'll need supplies," she said steadily, gathering bandages and medicines with deliberate movements. Harmon allowed this, but his impatience was palpable. "Hurry up. Every lawman in the county's looking for us." Once they had assembled basic medical supplies, Harmon marched them out the back door of the clinic. Two horses waited there, held by another rough-looking man. Of the other gang members, there was no sign. "Where are the others?" Abigail asked as Harmon roughly helped her mount behind the second outlaw. "Dead or scattered," Harmon growled. "Your Marshal friend's got a lot to answer for." Lucas was alive then. Relief flooded Abigail, giving her strength. They rode south, away from town, Dr. Harrison sharing a horse with Harmon. After about 2 miles, they turned east, following a creek until they reached an abandoned trapper's cabin tucked against a rocky hillside. Inside, lit by a single lantern, a man lay on a crude pallet, his face contorted with pain, his chest soaked with blood. This, Abigail realized, was Calvin Harmon. The younger brother Jeremiah had broken out of jail. Dr. Harrison immediately knelt beside the wounded man, examining him with professional detachment despite the circumstances. Abigail assisted, passing instruments and supplies as needed. "Bullets lodged near his lung," Dr. Harrison reported grimly. "He's lost a lot of blood. Fix him," Jeremiah demanded, his gun never wavering. "I'll try," Dr. Harrison replied honestly, "but he needs proper facilities, not a filthy cabin." "Just do it," Jeremiah snapped, "or I start shooting." For the next hour, Abigail and her father worked to save Calvin Harmon's life. The procedure was difficult in the poor light with limited supplies, but Dr. Harrison was skilled and Abigail an able assistant. They extracted the bullet, sutured damaged blood vessels, cleaned and dressed the wound. By the end, Calvin's breathing had steadied, though he remained unconscious, his pulse weak but regular. "He needs rest," Dr. Harrison informed Jeremiah, washing blood from his hands in a basin of creek water. "And clean bandages twice daily. If infection sets in, there's little more I can do out here." Jeremiah nodded, some of the wild desperation leaving his eyes. "You did good, Doc, both of you." He glanced at his companion who had kept watch at the window throughout the procedure. "Bind them, Tom. We'll decide what to do with them later." Tom efficiently tied their hands with strips of rawhide, securing them to wooden support posts on opposite sides of the cabin. Jeremiah checked the bonds, then settled near his brother, watching his breathing with evident concern. The night crept by slowly. Abigail dozed fitfully, awakening whenever Calvin moaned or Jeremiah moved about the cabin. By dawn, she was stiff and thirsty, her wrists raw from the bindings. As light filtered through the cabin's single grimy window, Jeremiah conferred quietly with Tom, their voices too low for Abigail to make out words. Finally, Jeremiah approached her. "Your father says Calvin can't be moved yet," he said, his tone accusatory, as if this were somehow their fault. "He's right," Abigail confirmed. "Moving him now could reopen the wound. He'd bleed to death." Jeremiah cursed under his breath. "How long?" "At least 2 days," she replied honestly. "Maybe more. We don't have 2 days," Tom interjected nervously. "Every lawman in Texas is looking for us by now." "We stay," Jeremiah decided after a moment's consideration. "Calvin's all the family I got left. I ain't leaving him." The day passed with excruciating slowness. Tom left briefly to hunt, returning with 2 rabbits that he roasted over a small fire. He allowed Abigail and her father to eat, untying one hand each so they could feed themselves. Calvin drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to speak weakly with his brother, other times delirious with fever. Dr. Harrison, permitted to examine him periodically, grew increasingly concerned. "The wound is showing signs of infection," he told Jeremiah late that afternoon. "He needs medicine I don't have here." "What medicine?" Jeremiah demanded. "Quinine 4-1. "And stronger antiseptics than what we brought." Jeremiah paced the small cabin, conflict evident on his face. "Tom can go back to town after dark, try to get what you need. They'll be watching for your men," Abigail pointed out, "and they'll have realized we're missing by now." Jeremiah stopped pacing, studying her with narrowed eyes. "What are you suggesting, girl?" Abigail met his gaze steadily. "Let my father go. He can bring back what Calvin needs without arousing suspicion." Tom laughed harshly. "And lead the Marshal straight to us. Do we look stupid?" "My father won't do that," Abigail stated firmly. "Not if you keep me here." She ignored her father's alarmed expression. "He's a doctor. He took an oath to preserve life, even the life of an outlaw." Jeremiah considered her words, glancing between her and Dr. Harrison. "That true, Doc?" "You'd come back for your daughter, no lawman following?" "Yes," Dr. Harrison replied without hesitation. "But I want your word that Abigail won't be harmed while I'm gone." Jeremiah Harmon might be an outlaw, but he understood the code of the West. A man's word still meant something. "She'll be safe as long as you keep yours," he agreed. "But if I see a single badge within a mile of this cabin—" "You won't," Dr. Harrison assured him. "I'll say I'm gathering herbs for medicines. No one will question it." As sunset approached, Jeremiah united Dr. Harrison and provided him with a list of supplies they needed, both medical and practical. "Be back by midnight," he instructed. "Any later and I'll assume you've brought trouble." Abigail embraced her father tightly before he left. "Be careful," she whispered. "I'll return as quickly as I can," he promised, his eyes conveying everything words couldn't. His fear for her, his determination to save her, his trust in her strength. After he departed, Jeremiah retied Abigail to the support post, though he allowed her enough slack to sit comfortably on the floor. He then resumed his vigil by Calvin's side, bathing his brother's fevered brow with creek water. The intimacy of the scene, a hardened outlaw tenderly caring for his brother, struck Abigail powerfully. "You really love him," she observed quietly. Jeremiah glanced up, surprised by her comment. "He's my brother," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. Perhaps it did. "How did you end up like this?" Abigail asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her fear. "On the run, robbing banks." Jeremiah was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke, his voice distant with memory. "War changed everything, came home to nothing. Farm seized for taxes while we were fighting for the Confederacy. Mother dead from typhoid. Father tried to rebuild, but..." He shrugged. "Banks don't care about a man's reasons, only his money." It was a familiar story across the South and parts of the West, families destroyed by war and its aftermath, turning to outlawry when legitimate paths were closed to them. It didn't justify their actions, but it explained them. "There are other ways," Abigail said gently. "Other choices." Jeremiah's expression hardened. "Not for men like us, not anymore." The conversation lapsed into silence. As darkness fell, Tom lit the lantern and took up position by the window, watching the approach to the cabin. Calvin's condition worsened, his breathing becoming more labored, his skin hot with fever. Time crawled by. Midnight approached, and with it, growing tension in the small cabin. Tom checked his pocket watch repeatedly. Jeremiah paced, pausing occasionally to check on Calvin or peer out the window into the darkness. "He ain't coming back," Tom declared as the watch showed 15 minutes past midnight. "He'll be here," Abigail insisted, though her own worry was mounting. What if something had happened to her father? What if Lucas had prevented him from returning, not realizing the consequences? Another 30 minutes passed. Jeremiah's expression grew increasingly dark, his hand straying to his revolver as he glanced repeatedly at Abigail. Just as the tension seemed ready to snap, a sound came from outside, the soft whicker of a horse approaching. Tom moved to the door, gun drawn, while Jeremiah positioned himself protectively near Calvin, his own weapon aimed at Abigail. "It's Dr. Harrison," her father's voice called from the darkness. "I'm alone, as promised." Tom cracked the door, peering out suspiciously before allowing Dr. Harrison to enter. He carried saddlebags bulging with supplies, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief at seeing Abigail unharmed. "You're late," Jeremiah accused, though he lowered his gun slightly. "Had to wait for the clinic to empty," Dr. Harrison explained, already moving to Calvin's side. "Your raid left several wounded, and the Marshal is organizing search parties for us." Abigail's heart leapt. "Lucas, is he all right?" Her father nodded, unpacking medicines and fresh bandages. "Wounded but walking, he's leading the search himself." He gave her a significant look as he bent over Calvin. "They're checking north and west first." The message was clear. Lucas was looking in the wrong direction. They were on their own. Through the night, Dr. Harrison and Abigail, whose bonds were loosened to allow her to assist, fought to save Calvin Harmon's life. The infection had taken firm hold, and despite the medicines, his condition continued to deteriorate. By dawn, it was clear they were losing the battle. Calvin's breathing was shallow, his pulse erratic. Jeremiah, understanding what was happening, became increasingly agitated, alternating between threats and desperate pleas for the doctors to do more. "I'm sorry," Dr. Harrison finally said, straightening from his examination. "The infection has reached his bloodstream. There's nothing more we can do." "No," Jeremiah refused to accept it, grabbing Dr. Harrison's shirt front. "You fix him, Doc. You fix him, or I swear, let him go," Abigail intervened, her voice steady despite her fear. "My father's done everything possible. Calvin's beyond human help now." Jeremiah released Dr. Harrison, his anger collapsing into grief as he looked at his brother's ashen face. He sank to his knees beside the pallet, taking Calvin's limp hand in his own. "Don't you die on me, Cal," he murmured. You're all I got left. But Calvin Harmon was beyond hearing. An hour later, he drew his last rattling breath, his hand still clasped in his brother's. The death changed everything. Jeremiah, after sitting motionless beside his brother's body for long minutes, rose with a terrible calm that was somehow more frightening than his earlier rage. "Tom," he said quietly, "get the horses ready." "What about them?" Tom asked, gesturing toward Abigail and her father. Jeremiah studied them, his expression unreadable. "Tie them. Leave them enough slack to free themselves eventually. By then, we'll be long gone." Abigail exchanged a glance with her father, relief washing through her. They would live. Tom efficiently bound them to the support posts again, this time with looser knots that could eventually be worked free. Meanwhile, Jeremiah wrapped his brother's body in a blanket and carried it outside. Before departing, Jeremiah paused at the cabin door, looking back at Abigail and her father. "You did your best for Cal," he acknowledged. "That counts for something in my book." His expression hardened. "But if that Marshal of yours comes after us again, all debts are canceled. Remember that." With those parting words, the outlaws departed, taking Calvin's body with them. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving Abigail and her father alone in the silent cabin. "Are you all right?" Dr. Harrison asked anxiously, already working at his bonds. "I'm fine," Abigail assured him, likewise struggling with the rawhide strips binding her wrists. "Just worried about Lucas, if Jeremiah encounters him." "Dawson's smart," her father replied, "and he has men with him. Jeremiah Harmon's on the run now, not hunting." It took nearly an hour for them to free themselves from the loosened bonds. By then, both were stiff and sore, but otherwise unharmed. They gathered what supplies they could carry and set out on foot toward Madisonville, following the creek that would eventually lead them to the main road. They had walked perhaps 2 miles when the sound of approaching riders reached them. Abigail and her father took cover in the brush alongside the trail, uncertain whether the newcomers were friend or foe. Abigail's heart leapt when she recognized the lead rider. "Lucas!" she cried, emerging from hiding. Lucas Dawson reined his horse sharply, disbelief and joy washing over his face as he spotted her. "Abigail!" He practically flung himself from the saddle, crossing the distance between them in long strides despite his still healing leg. "Thank God," he breathed, gathering her into his arms. I'm all right," she assured him, clinging to him with equal fervor. "We both are." Lucas released her only long enough to shake Dr. Harrison's hand with genuine relief before pulling Abigail close again, as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "The Harmons?" he asked, his expression darkening. "Gone," Dr. Harrison reported. "Headed east about 2 hours ago. Calvin Harmon is dead infection from a gunshot wound." Lucas nodded grimly. "We'll send a telegraph ahead, alert lawmen in the eastern counties." He looked down at Abigail, his eyes softening. "But right now, I'm more concerned with getting you both home safely." They returned to Madisonville as heroes, the town turning out to welcome them with relief and celebration. Abigail was overwhelmed by the outpouring of concern and joy at their safe return. Even those who had been skeptical of a female doctor now regarded her with newfound respect. That evening, after being examined by her father and pronounced exhausted but unharmed, Abigail sat with Lucas on the clinic porch, watching the stars emerge in the Texas sky. "I thought I'd lost you," Lucas admitted, his arm around her shoulders, holding her close against the cooling night air. "When we realized you and your father were missing." "You almost did," Abigail replied softly. "Jeremiah was unpredictable if Calvin hadn't needed medical care." Lucas's arm tightened around her. "I would have found you," he said with quiet conviction. "I would have searched every inch of Texas if I had to." Abigail looked up at him, her heart full. "I believe you would have." Their lips met in a kiss that spoke of fear conquered, of separation endured, of love proven in the crucible of danger. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "Marry me," he whispered. Abigail drew back slightly, searching his face in the lamplight spilling from the clinic window. "What? Marry me," Lucas repeated, more firmly this time. "I love you, Abigail Harrison. These past days, thinking I might never see you again. I don't want to waste another moment." Joy bubbled up within her, bright and irrepressible. "Are you sure? Your work, the Marshal service, I resigned this morning," he interrupted. "Telegraphed my resignation to Austin after you were taken. Some things are more important than the badge." His expression grew serious. "I can't promise life will always be safe, but I can promise to love you every day I'm given, to build something real with you." Tears of happiness blurred Abigail's vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Lucas Dawson." His smile illuminated the night as he pulled her close again, sealing their promise with a kiss that felt like coming home. 2 weeks later, word reached Madisonville that Jeremiah Harmon had been killed in a shootout with Texas Rangers near the Louisiana border. Tom Sullivan, his remaining companion, was captured and would stand trial for multiple robberies and murders. The Harmon gang, terror of the Texas frontier, was no more. For Lucas and Abigail, the news brought closure and the freedom to look forward without shadows from the past. Lucas accepted Sheriff Morgan's offer to become Madisonville's permanent deputy, a position that would allow him to use his skills while remaining close to home. Abigail continued working alongside her father in the clinic, earning respect and trust from the community with each patient she treated. They were married that autumn, on a golden October day when the Texas hills were painted in russet and amber. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the same church that had sheltered women and children during the Harmon gang's raid. Dr. Harrison gave his daughter away with proud tears in his eyes, whispering as he placed her hand in Lucas's. "He's a good man, Abby, the kind worth building a life with." Abigail, radiant in a cream-colored gown sent from Boston by her medical school friends, had never been more certain of anything in her life. "I take this man," she vowed, her voice steady and clear, "to love and honor all the days of my life." Lucas, handsome in a new black suit, his badge temporarily set aside for the occasion, repeated the same promise. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas gathered Abigail into his arms with such evident joy that the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration continued long into the evening, with music and dancing, food and laughter. As twilight fell, Lucas led his bride away from the festivities to the small house he'd purchased on the edge of town, a white clapboard cottage with a wraparound porch and enough land for a garden and perhaps, someday, room for children to play. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," he murmured as he carried her across the threshold. Abigail wrapped her arms around his neck, happiness overflowing. "Home," she echoed, the word holding all the promise of their future together. "I like the sound of that. Years passed, seasons turning in their natural rhythm." Madisonville grew as the railroad finally reached the town in 1876, bringing new opportunities and residents. Dr. Harrison continued to serve as the town's primary physician, though he gradually shifted more responsibilities to Abigail, whose reputation as a skilled healer spread throughout the county. Lucas proved an exceptional deputy, his experience and fair-mindedness earning respect from even the most troublesome elements in the growing community. When Sheriff Morgan retired in 1878, the town council unanimously elected Lucas Dawson as his replacement. Their personal happiness grew alongside their professional success. In the spring of 1875, Abigail gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, christened Elizabeth after Lucas's mother. In 1880, their family was completed with the arrival of another son, Thomas. Through it all, their love deepened and matured, weathering the inevitable challenges of life on the frontier drought years when crops failed and money was tight. A diphtheria outbreak that tested Abigail's medical skills and emotional strength. the occasional lawless element that required Lucas to don his gun belt and face danger. They never forgot how their story began with a gunshot, a wounded marshal, and a courageous young doctor who didn't mind getting blood on her dress. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on their porch watching the Texas stars, Lucas would trace the scar on his shoulder and remember. "Best bullet I ever took," he would say, pulling Abigail close against his side. And she would smile, remembering that first connection, the moment when their lives had irrevocably intertwined. "I still don't mind," she would reply softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "I never have." On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1894, with their children nearly grown, James studying medicine at his mother's alma mater, Elizabeth teaching at the town school, and Thomas learning the law enforcement trade from his father, Lucas surprised Abigail with a special gift: a small, leather-bound journal. Inside were all the letters he had written to her during that first separation, when he was tracking the Harmon gang, including the ones he had composed in his mind but never had the opportunity to send. "I promised I'd write," he explained as she leafed through the pages with wonder, "and a Dawson always keeps his promises." That night, by lamplight, Abigail read Lucas's words from 20 years earlier, his growing feelings for her, his hopes for the future, his fear that his dangerous profession would make a life together impossible. The last entry, dated the day before he returned to Madisonville wounded, contained a simple truth that had shaped their lives together. "I realize now that home isn't a place. It's where your heart feels complete. And my heart, against all odds and expectations, has found its home in Madisonville with a remarkable woman who wasn't afraid of a little blood." As she closed the journal, Abigail looked across the room at her husband, older now, silver threading his dark hair, lines of experience etched around his eyes, but still the same man who had captured her heart that fateful day in 1874. "I love you, Lucas Dawson," she said simply. "Every day more than the last," he crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "And I love you, Abigail Dawson, always have, always will." In that moment, as they stood together in the home they had built, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, Abigail reflected on the unexpected path that had led her here. A single act of courage and compassion helping a wounded stranger despite the danger had changed everything. She wouldn't have had it any other way. As the century drew to a close and a new one dawned, bringing automobiles and telephones, electricity and motion pictures, Madisonville evolved as well. The old wooden buildings of its early days gave way to brick and stone structures. The stagecoach station where Lucas had once waited to ambush outlaws became the town's first automobile garage. The clinic, where Abigail had removed that first bullet, expanded into a proper hospital, with Dr. Abigail Dawson serving as its chief physician after her father's retirement. Through it all, the Dawsons remained a cornerstone of the community, their love story becoming part of local legend, how the lady doctor and the wounded marshal had found each other amid gunfire and danger, building a legacy of healing and justice that shaped Madisonville for generations. And when asked about the secret to their enduring marriage, Abigail would often share the moment that had started it all, the simple exchange that had defined their relationship from the very beginning. He said, "You'll get blood on you," and I said, "I don't mind." For in those words lay the essence of true love, the willingness to accept another person completely, wounds and all, and to stand together through whatever life might bring.